After 9/11, America did not just go after those who perpetrated that tragic, vicious attack. It unleashed a campaign on nations that had nothing to do with 9/11. We're talking about Iraq, where hundreds of thousands of innocent civilians have died since 2003. America has been in constant wars since 9/11 in different countries. Are we talking about one of the most profound overreactions in military history? To talk about that, I'm joined by Colonel Lawrence Wilkerson, who served as Colin Powell's Chief of Staff. Colin Powell, Secretary of State under George W. Bush. Colonel Wilkerson, thank you so much for joining me.
Thanks for having me.
More than 6,000 American servicemen have died in the last decade of war spawned by the 9/11 attack. Tragedy worth remembering and knowing, no doubt. But why in all those speeches delivered by American officials, I never hear about hundreds of thousands of innocent civilians dead in the wars waged by the United States in other countries like Iraq?
As a collective entity, we seem to think we're exceptional, and so exceptional that we don't have to think about other people in the world. As I said, that's a position you can maintain as long as you are as powerful as we were, powerful as Rome in its day, post-World War II. But we're no longer that powerful, and our powerful recedes even as we speak here today.
Some of the people who were at the helm back then are now writing books saying everything they did was right, including Guantanamo, including everything else. I'm talking about Dick Cheney, first of all, Vice President under George W. Bush. And at the same time, they're all blaming each other for something. Why all this confusion? And should one be worried about the general picture that's being created of the last decade of war?
Because they're all trying to blame each other and trying to get out of some of the blame. And yes, we should be concerned. Why are they trying to blame each other? Let's face a fact here for a moment that most Americans don't even think about. 9/11 happened on George W. Bush and Dick Cheney's watch. They allowed the greatest killing of Americans on American territory since Pearl Harbor. A lot of their rhetoric and aggressive actions post 9/11 was to hide that fact, and also to keep it from happening again, because if it had happened again, they probably would have been impeached on the spot, thrown out of office. So we spent $4 trillion to counter an attack by bin Laden and Zawahiri that cost maybe $500,000. That's not very cost effective. That's really bad. It's bad business. You have to understand that, first of all, about the Bush-Cheney administration. The second thing you have to understand, I think, is that we have made a cottage industry, if not a much more than a cottage industry, out of what my former boss, Colin Powell, has called the terrorist industrial complex. Lots of people are making lots of money off of this so-called global war on terror.
You were saying that you had lots of doubts about building this case for war in Iraq. Was it possible at some point to stand up and say, no, we have doubts, we're not writing this speech, we're out of it?
We all did at key points in the preparation of Colin Powell's presentation. On some of those occasions, George Tenet and his deputy, John McLaughlin, said, okay, we'll throw that out.
The head of the CIA.
Head of the CIA and the director of Central Intelligence at the time. We'll throw that out. And they threw it out. The real essence of that presentation, though, they preserved, they being George Tenet and John McLaughlin, and I think under some strong influence from the Vice President's office, they preserved, and that was the mobile biological laboratories, that was the active nuclear program, as symbolized by the aluminum tubes, and it was the existing chemical stocks and connections, hard connections, between Al-Qaeda and Baghdad. Those were the real falsehoods in that briefing that George Tenet and John McLaughlin, the representatives of not just the U.S. intelligence community, but of Israel, France, Britain, Jordan, and a host of others who were feeding intelligence into us. That's what they said was sacrosanct. They said that is the case. That is what Saddam Hussein is doing. Only later did we learn that even those elements of his presentation were composed of half-truths, falsehoods even, and I think today, after doing more research, outright lies. Lies created in the Defense Department under Undersecretary of Defense for Policy Doug Feith and his special Iraq team.
Why?
And lies created in the Vice President's office.
Why, in your opinion?
Because they wanted, for the same reason that in the summer of 2002, I have discovered that the emphasis on enhanced interrogation techniques changed subtly from being to try and find out if another attack were coming. After all, a lot of time had expired. If another attack were coming, it would have come. In the summer of 2002, it shifted subtly to enhanced interrogation in order to find out if Baghdad had contacts with al-Qaeda. So we were actually torturing people, not under the so-called smoking gun argument that we might have another attack so it was justified. We were torturing people so we could attack Iraq and convince the American people we should do so. That's how drastic it got. Now ask me why they wanted to go to war with Iraq and I'll give you a half a dozen answers. If it's Douglas Feith, it's protection of Israel. If it's Paul Wolfowitz, the Deputy Secretary of Defense, it's a little bit of Israel, it's a little bit of oil, and it's a little bit of bringing peace and democracy and freedom to the Middle East. If it's George Bush, it's, oh, I fear the nexus between al-Qaeda and Baghdad, which Cheney had convinced him of, I'm sure. George Tenet hadn't convinced him of it. George Tenet didn't think there was that big a nexus. With Dick Cheney, I think it was oil. Iraq right now is sitting on probably 200 billion barrels, maybe 300 billion barrels. That's Iraq's own oil report. That surpasses Saudi Arabia. If Iraq is sitting on 300 billion barrels of oil, if that turns out to be true, it'll be more than Saudi Arabia. Now you know why Dick Cheney went to war in Iraq. It also was the low-hanging fruit. North Korea was far more dangerous, but too difficult. 100,000 casualties were predicted by the Pentagon on both sides. Seoul would be destroyed. Iran was too difficult. 70 million people, not fractured like the Iraqis into Sunni and Shia and Christian and other. So the low-hanging fruit was Iraq.
To just use the moment in the wake of 9/11?
They used the moment in the wake of 9/11 to divert from Afghanistan, our real target, should have been our real target, and go to Iraq. That's exactly what they did.
You said you would testify if they put someone like Dick Cheney on trial now. What would you accuse them of?
I think he's already done it. No one needs to accuse him of anything. He has admitted publicly, it is on videotape, that he condoned waterboarding, that he would still waterboard, that he does not believe waterboarding is torture. Waterboarding is torture. There's a ipso facto case. The man's guilty.
But they're saying they did it in the best interest of their country. It seems to be the ultimate reasoning which can't be confronted. What would you say to that?
I say that the end never justifies the means. And the question is, does the lesser evil ever justify itself because it prevents a greater evil? There are some real problems with that argument, though. Logical problems as well as philosophical and what I would call value-laden problems. First is you can never know a hypothetical. You never know if your lesser evil action actually prevented the greater evil. Dick Cheney spends hours on television and elsewhere and in this book trying to say that his actions prevented a greater evil, another attack on the United States and so forth. Well, that's his interpretation. My interpretation of the bureaucracy, which is probably far better than his because I was buried in it. I heard people talking about it every day. So bottom line is, I know what Dick Cheney doesn't know because he was in the ivory palace and he can't know. Horse holders surround Dick Cheney. The people who surround Dick Cheney are David Addington and John Hanna and Scooter Libby, and they tell Dick Cheney what Dick Cheney wants to hear. George Tenet told Dick Cheney what Dick Cheney wanted to hear. Oh yes, it's working, Mr. Vice President. We're getting great information and we're stopping terrorist attacks. That is utter bullshit. They didn't stop anything through enhanced interrogation techniques. I have that from some of the most respected people in the FBI and the intelligence community. So I can't fault Dick Cheney for not knowing the truth because he couldn't know the truth. He's trapped. He's trapped in his own milieu. But the truth is the methods don't work and they rebound to your discredit and they recruit, as you said, for your enemy. Dick Cheney is asked, what would happen if an American were captured in Iran? And what would happen if they waterboarded him because they thought he was a threat to the state of Iran and so forth? He just skirted around the question. What he really said was, if you listen closely, Americans are better than anybody else in the world. Americans shouldn't be waterboarded. But anybody else, we can waterboard, especially if we're Americans doing it. That's essentially what Dick Cheney said. Now, here's the kicker. About 40% of America agrees with him. You poll. You look at the polls that have been done. About 40% of America at any given time They think that Americans have the right to torture other people, and other people don't have the rights to torture Americans for various reasons. Most of them think it's that way because we have a bigger gun. That's why they think we can get away with it and do it, because we have a bigger gun. That's why I say the reckoning is coming. The reckoning when we are just another country in the world. And that day is coming. It may not come in my lifetime, but unfortunately I think it's coming in my children and my grandchildren's lifetime. And this is going to be a hard time for Washington, because we're no longer going to have the money, we're no longer going to have the economic might, we're no longer going to have the military might and so forth to say to the world, we can torture you, but you can't torture us.
Many say that America's response to 9/11 was one of the most profound overreactions in military history. Would you agree with that?
I think initially it was proportional, it was rational, it was fairly well supported in the international community, and it was
Afghanistan.
sound. Yes, the initial reaction. What we should have done was gone to Afghanistan as we did what we did. About 6 months later, said, okay, here's your government, Karzai, you've got it. Go ahead and run your country as best you can. We'll give you economic and financial support from afar. We're going home. Oh, by the way, footnote, if you entertain terrorists in this country again, we'll come back and do it again.
In what way could that overreaction backfire?
I think it already has. And this is a profound change, really, that's happened since World War II. It's been creeping up on us. And now with Libya, it's here. We have an executive power that is beyond any check by the people, by the Congress, or by the courts for war. We can go to war at the drop of a coin. It matters not that the Obama administration, and I have to say I voted for President Obama, it matters not that they have protested rather futilely and idiotically, really, that they weren't involved in hostilities, that the War Powers Act was not relevant and so forth. It certainly was. Anytime you kill people for state purposes, the War Powers Act is relevant and the Constitution is relevant. We've reached a point now where the President of the United States can kill people for state purposes anytime he or she feels the need. James Madison said very eloquently, when you combine the power to initiate war with the power to execute it, you have achieved tyranny. That is a very profoundly worrying situation in this that's happened in this country.